I spent 28 years as a silviculturist for the U.S. Forest Service before I retired to run a small maple operation inside a 28-family sugaring cooperative in Vermont, a community built entirely around a recorded easement, letting our tubing network cross more than a dozen properties to reach a shared sugar house that's been boiling sap since 1961. Then my new neighbor poured a concrete driveway straight across that easement in the middle of March, severing 40 taps worth of tubing 3 days before the best sap run of the season. And when I asked our cooperative to enforce the covenant protecting that line, I learned that the professional forester we'd trusted with our whole sugar bush for a decade had been quietly cutting and selling our own timber out from under us the entire time. By the time the state finished its audit, the sap lines were the smallest thing he'd been taking. My name is Constance Halverson. Everyone here calls me Connie. I'm 63, and I spent 28 years as a silviculturist with the U.S. Forest Service's Green Mountain office before I retired 4 years ago to run Halverson Sugar Works out of a converted dairy barn on 11 acres inside Sugarbush Ridge, a cooperative of 28 family properties built around one of the oldest, continuously operating shared sugar bushes in this part of Vermont. My husband Arn passed 6 years ago, not long before I retired, and running this operation alone since then has been the thing that's kept me from simply rattling around an empty house through 6 long winters. Sugarbush Ridge was organized in 1961 by a group of dairy farmers who'd inherited scattered stands of sugar maple across their adjoining hillside properties, and realized, correctly, that none of them individually had enough tappable trees to run a commercially viable operation, but that all of them together did. Rather than simply carve the sugar bush into small, uneconomical parcels, the founding families recorded something unusual for a rural cooperative: a sapline access and sugar bush easement, attached to all 28 deeds, granting the cooperative's tubing network permanent right-of-way across every property boundary within the sugar bush, along with a shared, professionally managed forest stewardship plan covering the entire tract as a single ecological unit, rather than 28 separate backyards. I want to explain why that forest stewardship plan matters as much as it does, because it's the whole reason this story goes the way it does. Vermont's Use Value Appraisal Program, which almost everyone here calls current use, lets landowners enrolled in active forestry or agriculture pay dramatically reduced property tax, provided the enrolled land is managed under a state-approved forest management plan and actually harvested according to that plan's sustainable yield schedule, rather than clear-cut or neglected. Nearly every property in Sugarbush Ridge sits in current use, and the cooperative's shared forest management plan is the single document that keeps all 28 of us qualified for that reduced tax rate, reviewed and recertified by the state roughly every 10 years. For a lot of our members, especially the newer buyers who came here for the acreage rather than any real interest in maple production, current use isn't some abstract regulatory line item. It's the difference between a property tax bill they can comfortably manage and one that would force some of them to sell. A handful of the smaller parcels here, 6 or 7 acres with modest tap counts, would see their annual tax bill multiply several times over if they were ever assessed at ordinary residential rates instead of the reduced forestry rate. I've sat with more than one newer neighbor at a fall meeting, walking them through exactly why the stewardship plan mattered beyond the trees themselves, and I don't think any of us, myself included, ever fully appreciated back then how much that reduced rate depended entirely on one person's paperwork being honest. I've served on the cooperative's forestry committee for 3 of my 4 years here, a volunteer role that mostly involves reviewing the annual tap count, coordinating the spring boil schedule, and occasionally walking a disputed property line with a neighbor who isn't sure whose maple is whose. It's work I love, since it lets me use the same close attention to forest health and sustainable yield that defined my whole career, just aimed at a few hundred acres of sugar maple instead of a national forest. Our cooperative, like a lot of small agricultural associations, has always relied on one outside professional to handle the genuinely technical side of managing the sugar bush as a working forest. A licensed consulting forester named Gareth Applewhite, retained for 10 consecutive years to conduct the annual timber stand improvement work, mark trees for any necessary thinning, and prepare the paperwork the state requires to keep our current use enrollment intact. Gareth came recommended by 2 other maple cooperatives when the board first hired him, and over a decade he built a reputation as the one person who genuinely understood silviculture well enough that the rest of the volunteer board, myself included, rarely questioned his marking decisions in any real technical detail. My days these days run entirely on the sugaring calendar. Late winter means checking tubing lines the moment the frost starts easing, since a single pinhole leak can cost a whole day's sap run before anyone notices. The boil itself, 6 to 8 weeks most years, means round-the-clock shifts at the sugar house. Syrup grated and jarred the same week it comes off the evaporator. Summer and fall are quieter, mostly tubing maintenance, and the forestry committee's slower work, walking timber stands and checking regeneration. It's a rhythm that took some real adjustment after decades of an ordinary Forest Service schedule, but it's become the thing I genuinely look forward to each year now, the way Arn and I used to look forward to it together before he passed. Sugarbush Ridge has changed some since the founding families first organized it, the way any 60-year-old cooperative eventually does. A handful of founding families are still here, people who remember tapping trees by hand with buckets before the tubing network went in during the 80s. But a growing share of newer buyers came specifically for the rural acreage and the current use tax break rather than any real investment in maple sugaring itself. Buyers who understand the cooperative exists but don't always understand why the shared forest management plan matters as much as it does. I don't hold that against anyone. You don't need to love silviculture to love owning 11 quiet acres in Vermont. But it does mean fewer and fewer residents each year could actually explain our own forest management plan from memory, myself and a shrinking handful of others aside. Halverson Sugar Works itself runs almost entirely on my own labor these days, with 2 part-time hands I bring on for the boil each spring, tapping close to 900 trees across my own 11 acres and my allotted share of the cooperative's central sugar bush. I sell most of what I make direct to a handful of regional grocers and a mail order list Arn and I built up over 2 decades. The kind of small operation that survives less on volume than on the reputation a family builds jar by jar over 60 years. I've spent enough spring mornings walking the tubing lines at first light, breath fogging in the cold, listening for the particular hiss of a good vacuum draw, to understand exactly how much invisible upkeep sits underneath something that looks, from a tourist's perspective at the Sugar House gift shop, like nothing more complicated than a jug of syrup on a shelf. I still remember 4 years ago, sitting through my first forestry committee meeting and watching Gareth walk the room through that year's timber stand improvement recommendations with the easy, technical fluency of a man who'd clearly done this 100 times before, citing basal area and stalking density figures with a confidence the rest of us simply took at face value. I remember thinking at the time how fortunate we were to have a professional this competent handling something this specialized. It didn't occur to me until years later to wonder whether that same fluency might, eventually, become exactly the kind of cover a real problem could hide behind. The lot at the top of the ridge, a modest farmhouse that had sat with an elderly couple in it for as long as I'd lived here, sold last autumn to a man named Bradley Stanhope, a contractor from just over the New Hampshire line, who told the neighbors who welcomed him that he wanted a proper paved driveway before winter, since the old dirt track had given him trouble getting his equipment trailer up the hill. I thought little of it that fall, since wanting a decent driveway is an entirely ordinary thing for a new homeowner to want, sapline easement or not. It wasn't until the ground firmed up in March, right as I was walking the upper tubing lines checking for winter damage before the season's first good sap run, that I found the trench. Bradley's crew had cut straight across the recorded easement corridor, snapping the main lateral line feeding 40 taps on the upper slope, and poured concrete into the trench before I ever had a chance to flag the conflict. I walked up to his place that same afternoon, mostly out of the same instinct that had made me flag 100 boundary conflicts over the course of my career before raising an alarm. "I don't think we've properly met," I said. "I'm Connie, from the Forestry Committee. I have to ask about that new driveway. It cuts straight across our recorded sapline easement, and it's already severed 40 taps worth of tubing." Bradley looked genuinely confused by the question, which I took, in that first conversation, as a reasonably good sign. Gareth signed off on this personally, he said. I told him where I wanted the driveway, and he said the easement corridor was flexible enough that it wouldn't be an issue, since he already understood the whole layout better than most people would. There's a recorded fixed-width easement corridor here, I told him. It's not usually something people pour concrete across without a formal review. Would you mind if I asked the Forestry Committee to double-check the paperwork? Sure, go ahead, Bradley said, with the easy confidence of a man who believed he'd done everything correctly and paid good money to be sure of it. I've got a signed letter from Gareth saying the driveway location was fine. I don't have any reason to think there's a problem on my end. I want to explain why I didn't simply call the town's road foreman that same afternoon and let the matter resolve through ordinary driveway permit code alone, since a neighbor or two suggested exactly that once word got around. Our town's driveway permit process governs grading, drainage, and road frontage sightlines, but it has no mechanism at all for enforcing a private, recorded sugarbush easement specific to our cooperative, a document that exists entirely outside the town's ordinary permitting review and depends entirely on our own cooperative actually enforcing it. A town inspection confirming Bradley's driveway met ordinary grading rules would have told me nothing at all about whether it had been poured across ground the cooperative had a recorded right to keep clear. I pulled our own recorded easement from the County Land Records Office that same evening, along with the original 1961 Sugarbush survey the founding families had commissioned before ever organizing the cooperative, documents I'd reviewed more than once in my 4 years on the Forestry Committee. The easement was exactly as specific as I remembered, a fixed 30-foot corridor reserved for tubing access across every affected lot, with any new construction crossing that corridor requiring a formal Forestry Committee review that Bradley's project, as far as I could find in our own meeting minutes, had never actually received. I called our cooperative's small administrative office the next morning and asked to see the Forestry Committee's file on Bradley's driveway. The part-time administrator who answered told me, after checking, that the approval had been handled entirely by Gareth directly, with no committee review documented anywhere in the file, which struck me immediately as unusual, since every other easement-adjacent construction request I'd reviewed in 4 years on the committee had gone through our full seasonal review process before approval. I called Gareth directly that same afternoon. I understand you're upset about a neighbor's driveway, he said, in the practiced, unhurried tone he'd used at committee meetings for as long as I'd known him. But I looked at the corridor myself and didn't think it needed the full committee's time. Sometimes a straightforward request doesn't need the whole process. This isn't a straightforward request, I said. It's a concrete driveway poured directly across a recorded 30-foot tubing corridor. I'd like to see the review you actually did, because it isn't in the committee's files. I'll have to pull my notes, Gareth said. I don't keep every site visit documented in the shared file. Some of my review work is more informal than that, especially for requests I'm confident about. That answer, a 10-year consulting forester admitting that his own personal, undocumented judgment had substituted for our cooperative's actual easement review process, was the moment I stopped assuming this was a simple oversight. I walked the full length of the severed lateral line the following week, mapping exactly how much of that spring sap run had been lost before the tubing crew could reroute around Bradley's driveway, the same close, patient measurement I used to do assessing storm damage across a whole national forest stand. The lost run came to nearly 900 gallons of sap, roughly a fifth of what that section of the sugarbush would ordinarily produce in the season's best week, a loss large enough that, in my professional life, would have triggered an immediate incident report on any comparable right-of-way conflict. I brought the lost production numbers to Gareth directly at our next scheduled Forestry Committee meeting, laying out the figures against our recorded easement corridor. A loss this size on an easement this specific isn't normal, I told him. Either there's been a genuine misunderstanding about where the corridor actually sits, or somebody approved something that never should have passed review. Sap production estimates can vary a lot season to season, Gareth said. I wouldn't read too much into one bad week before we've seen how the rest of the run goes. I retained a property rights attorney the following week, a sharp, patient specialist named Imogen Calloway, who'd handled a handful of agricultural easement disputes for other Vermont cooperatives before ours. This is about as clean an easement violation as I've reviewed, she told me during our first meeting, spreading the survey and my production figures across her desk. A recorded 30-foot corridor this specific doesn't leave much room for informal review. Either your forester genuinely doesn't understand the corridor he's approving construction against, or he understands it perfectly well and approved this anyway. Imogen sent Gareth and the full board a formal written demand citing the easement, my production loss figures, and a request for the complete file behind Bradley's approval. The response, 2 weeks later, argued that the easement's corridor width was a general guideline rather than a strict boundary, a position Imogen found almost impressive in its willingness to invent a reading with no support anywhere in the easement's actual recorded text. Recorded easement widths aren't guidelines just because enforcing them is inconvenient for somebody, Imogen told me. This is a stalling position, not a real legal one. She pulled Vermont case law on recorded utility and access easements that same week, confirming that state courts have consistently treated a properly recorded, specifically dimensioned easement corridor as binding regardless of how informally any individual forester chose to administer it in practice. I brought the whole exchange to Bradley directly, catching him at his mailbox one evening. The committee's telling my attorney the corridor width is basically a suggestion, I told him. I don't think that's going to hold up, and I want you to understand this isn't personal. I just need our tubing network to keep working the way it's worked for 60 years. Bradley's expression shifted in a way that told me he'd started doing some research of his own. Look, Connie, I paid Gareth an expediting fee to get this handled fast, he said. $2,000, on top of whatever his normal consulting rate is, because my contractor's schedule was tight before winter set in. Nobody told me there was anything unusual about paying for faster service. I assumed that's just how this cooperative operates. That detail, an expediting fee paid specifically to get an approval that skipped the one review that actually mattered, was the first piece of information suggesting this was bigger than a single severed sap line. I called Otto Reinhold that same evening, mostly to ask whether he'd ever heard Gareth mention an expedited review option in the season he'd spent working alongside his crew. Never once, Otto told me. If there'd been a real fast-track process, I'd have known about it, since I was the one hauling brush for half his site visits that year. His answer confirmed something I'd already started to suspect. Whatever arrangement Bradley had paid for, it had never once involved the kind of careful site work Gareth's reputation was actually built on. I mentioned the fee to Millicent Vance, our cooperative's board president and one of the founding family's descendants, over coffee a few days later, mostly just to see whether she'd ever heard of such an arrangement being offered to anyone else. I don't recall an expediting fee ever being part of any process this board approved, she said, setting her cup down slowly. If Gareth's been offering homeowners a paid shortcut around the committee's review, that's not something I remember us ever voting on. Her reaction told me this wasn't some disclosed, board-sanctioned convenience. It was something happening quietly, off to the side of whatever process the rest of us thought we were all operating under together. Imogen laid out two paths that spring. The first was a straightforward easement enforcement action against Bradley directly, seeking either relocation of the driveway or compensation for the tubing network's lost production. The second, slower path, involved formally escalating the forester's own conduct, since a pattern of undocumented approvals tied to informal fees would eventually need to be surfaced to the state, given how directly it threatened our cooperative's current use enrollment. I'd pursue the easement claim against Bradley first, since that gets your tubing network back under control fastest, Imogen told me. The Gareth question is a longer process, but if there really is a pattern of informally approved violations, that's worth surfacing more broadly, rather than just handling it as a private dispute between neighbors. We filed the easement enforcement action that April, seeking a court order requiring Bradley to either relocate the driveway or fund a permanent below-grade tubing crossing engineered to survive future paving, along with damages for that spring's documented sap loss. Bradley, to his credit, didn't fight the underlying claim once he understood the easement's actual legal force. He brought in his own excavation contractor to assess options, genuinely more frustrated with Gareth's approval process than with any of his neighbors. Here's the micro setback. Engineering a proper below-grade crossing that could survive both the driveway's weight and future tubing maintenance access turned out to require a specialized contractor experienced with agricultural utility crossings, a process his own contractor estimated would take most of the summer, once permits and scheduling were accounted for, meaning the Upper Sugarbush faced a full season with a compromised network before any permanent fix could actually happen. Imogen negotiated an interim damages arrangement covering that season's lost production, but the physical crossing problem itself simply couldn't move faster than the specialized installation allowed. That whole summer was harder on the cooperative than I let on to Millicent during our regular check-ins, since a season's lost sap production isn't something you can simply make up for later in the year. Several of our smaller producer members lost a meaningful share of their own household income that season, all traceable, tap by tap, directly back to a driveway poured across ground that should have stayed clear. The hearing that August was brief, since Bradley's own contractor had independently confirmed the easement violation, and the court ordered the below-grade crossing completed within the timeline his contractor had proposed, along with the interim damages Imogen had negotiated. Bradley, for his part, seemed almost relieved to have a clear resolution rather than an open-ended dispute with neighbors he'd genuinely never meant to harm. "I want you to know, I'm not upset with you over any of this," Bradley told me outside the courthouse. "I paid good money to have this handled correctly. I'm the one who's out an expediting fee and a summer of specialized excavation, because somebody didn't do the one thing I paid them to do." I remember standing in that courthouse parking lot afterward, longer than I needed to, thinking the whole dispute had resolved about as cleanly as an easement enforcement action ever does. A clear violation, a contractor who didn't fight the survey, a judge who didn't need much convincing. It's strange now, looking back, how contained that afternoon felt at the time, given everything it turned out to be the opening chapter of. I assumed, walking out of that hearing, that this was substantially the end of it. I was wrong, and it was Imogen's follow-up records request to the cooperative, seeking documentation of every timber stand improvement decision Gareth had personally handled over the prior several years, that showed me exactly how wrong. The records the cooperative was eventually compelled to produce showed that Bradley's driveway wasn't an isolated lapse. Gareth's annual timber marking reports, compared against our own harvest logs, going back a decade, showed a consistent and growing gap between the volume of timber he'd reported marking for thinning and the volume our sugar house's own firewood and lumber contractor had actually hauled off the property each year. Imogen pulled the cooperative's full timber harvest ledger the same week, a routine step given how central Gareth's personal control over forest management had turned out to be, and what she found reframed the entire situation. Nested among years of legitimate thinning operations were a series of separate hauls, never once appearing in the cooperative's own harvest logs, sold directly to a regional lumber buyer under an account listing Gareth himself as the seller of record, rather than the cooperative. "Look at how consistently these unlogged hauls line up with the gaps in your own harvest records," Imogen told me, spreading a decade of timber buyer invoices across her office table. Every one of them happened right after Gareth's own marking survey, sold through his own name, with nothing ever making it back into any account the cooperative controls. I pulled the timber buyer's own purchase records that same week, out of the same instinct that had once sent me tracking down unauthorized cutting on federal land by its transport manifests, rather than its physical location. The buyer, a regional sawmill an hour south, confirmed that Gareth had personally sold them timber from the Sugarbush Ridge tract on 11 separate occasions over the past decade, always marked in his own name, always paid directly to an account that had nothing to do with the cooperative's own forestry budget. I drove up to Bradley's place that same week, mostly to let him know what Imogen had found, since his own rushed approval had turned out to be part of a much larger pattern. "I had no idea any of this was going on," he told me. "Gareth just seemed like the guy who had it all handled. I paid him because he made it sound like the sensible, professional way to get things approved fast." That detail, a decade-long consulting forester's reputation for technical authority apparently substituting, for years, for any actual outside verification of what he was actually cutting, turned out to matter more than either of us understood standing in his driveway that afternoon. Gareth Applewhite had served as Sugarbush Ridge's consulting forester for 10 consecutive years, a tenure built on a reputation, earned early, and never seriously questioned since. As the one professional whose technical judgment about our forest, the rest of us simply didn't feel qualified to second guess. Nobody in a decade of seasonal committee meetings had ever needed to ask what happened when the professional entrusted with protecting our cooperative's single most valuable shared asset started quietly selling pieces of it for himself. I want to answer plainly why Gareth believed he could run this pattern across a decade without anyone noticing. The honest answer is that forest management, for all its formal language in state regulations, ultimately depends on landowners trusting that whoever holds the technical expertise is actually reporting honestly. And Sugarbush Ridge, like a lot of small cooperatives that outsource this kind of specialized work, had simply never had a reason to independently verify that trust before a pattern this sustained came along. Imogen discovered, through the same records request, that Gareth's 11 documented timber sales totaled just over $210,000 across 10 years. Money that never once appeared in any cooperative financial statement any of us had reviewed and approved at a general meeting. I spent an evening that week going back through a decade of my own forestry committee notes, comparing them against the timber buyers' purchase dates, the same close, patient cross-referencing I used to do matching aerial survey photos against ground truth stand data. More than once, I found a season where Gareth's own marking report described light selective thinning, minimal volume. In the exact same weeks, the buyer's invoices showed a full logging crew and truck traffic, heavy enough that 2 of our members had separately complained about washboard ruts on the access road. Complaints Gareth had each time attributed to routine maintenance work nobody ever saw completed. I called a former colleague from my Forest Service days, a regional silviculture auditor named Priscilla Okonjo, who now consults on current use compliance disputes across northern New England, mostly to ask whether the kind of scheme Imogen had found was something she'd ever encountered elsewhere. I've seen a handful of cooperatives lose their current use enrollment because nobody was checking the harvest data closely enough against the actual stumpage sold, she told me over the phone. But I've never personally seen a forester monetize the gap this directly for this long. It's a genuinely brazen scheme, precisely because it exploits exactly the kind of specialized trust these arrangements depend on. Hearing that a pattern this specific still struck a career compliance auditor as unusual was, in its own way, more unsettling than if it had simply been common. I want to note here something that took me a while to fully process myself. Our own bylaws had always given any forestry committee member the authority to request an independent second opinion on any of Gareth's marking decisions, a right almost nobody on the committee had ever exercised in 4 years, myself included, simply because Gareth's technical explanations were fluent enough, on their face, that asking for a second opinion felt almost like an accusation, rather than routine diligence. I think about that reluctance more than almost anything else from this whole ordeal. How a genuinely reasonable norm, deferring to specialized expertise, can quietly curdle into exactly the blind spot somebody's counting on. The full picture, once Imogen retained an independent forestry auditor to reconcile 10 years of marking records against the timber buyer's purchase logs, was considerably worse than 11 unauthorized sales. The auditor's report traced a consistent pattern. Gareth's annual stewardship reports, submitted to the state current use program under penalty of decertification, systematically understated the actual volume harvested each year, always by roughly the same margin that matched the volume he'd separately sold off the books. This is the same shape as most of these schemes, once you actually trace the timber instead of just reading the paperwork, the forestry auditor told the board, laying 10 years of marking survey dates next to the timber buyer's purchase invoices. A person with sole control over both marking the harvest and reporting on it afterward has no natural check on either function. It's the pattern across 10 straight years that makes the intent unmistakable. I want to be honest that I didn't fully appreciate, until the auditor walked the board through it, how much this scheme had actually put at risk beyond the trees themselves. Every one of our 28 properties' current use tax status depends on that forest management plan being honestly followed, and a decade of understated stewardship reports submitted under the state's own penalty terms meant our entire cooperative's tax enrollment, and every household's reduced property tax bill tied to it, had been sitting on a foundation of falsified paperwork for years without any of us knowing. I spent a weekend that summer, walking the sugar bush alone with the auditor's stand maps, comparing the documented thinning locations against what actually remained standing. The same close, patient cross-referencing I used to do assessing storm damage across a whole national forest district. Several sections, even from the trail, showed clearings considerably larger than anything a legitimate thinning operation would have left. I didn't have the authority to confirm anything beyond a visual survey, but the shape of the pattern was becoming harder to unsee with every stand I walked. The forestry auditor pulled one more thread that reframed things again: Vermont's current use statute itself, which Imogen obtained the full text of through the same records request, explicitly required any consulting forester submitting an annual stewardship report to attest, under specific penalty terms including potential disqualification of the entire tract, that the harvest matched the approved management plan, an attestation Gareth had personally signed and submitted, falsely, on every one of 10 consecutive annual filings. I sat with the full audit report alone one evening before bringing it to the rest of the board, mostly because I wanted to be certain of what I was actually looking at, before asking 4 other volunteers to trust my read on something this serious. 10 years, 11 unauthorized sales, 10 false attestations to a state tax program, $210,000 collected under a management plan, meant to protect the whole cooperative's future. My daughter Ingrid called that same night for our usual check-in, and found me still at the kitchen table with the report spread out well past midnight, and she stayed on the phone quietly while I talked through it out loud, the same way I used to work through an ambiguous stand assessment with a colleague before committing to a final recommendation. I brought the audit report and Gareth's false attestations directly to our cooperative's 4 other board members at a specially called meeting, all of whom, to their credit, seemed genuinely stunned by the scale of what the documents showed. We trusted Gareth specifically because he was the one person who actually understood forestry in real technical depth, Millicent Vance told me, visibly shaken. I signed off on his stewardship reports for years without ever once asking to see the underlying harvest reconciliation. I understand now why that was more convenient for somebody than I ever realized. I requested Gareth's contract be terminated directly at that meeting, laying out the unauthorized timber sales and the falsified state attestations in front of a room that included several of the cooperative's smaller producer members whose own current use tax status had, unbeknownst to them, been put at risk by a decade of falsified paperwork. Every tree I've ever marked and sold reflected my honest professional judgment about which stems needed removal, Gareth said, when the board invited him to respond. I don't believe there's any actual fraud here. I was simply exercising discretion. The management plan doesn't explicitly forbid. You sold timber that never once appeared in our own harvest logs, kept the money in an account with your own name on it, and then lied to the state's current use program 10 separate times to cover for it, Millicent said. That's not discretion. That's a business you built quietly inside a professional retainer. The rest of us trusted you to fill honestly. A third board member, Otto Reinhold, a young tapper who'd bought into the cooperative only 3 years earlier, and who'd spent a season working alongside Gareth's crew before understanding any of this, asked the question that seemed to land hardest in that room. Gareth, did you personally handle every one of these sales yourself, or did somebody on your crew ever know what you were doing without saying anything? Gareth's answer was a long pause, followed by an admission that he had, in fact, personally arranged and collected payment for every sale himself across all 10 years, a detail that undercut whatever thin defense he might otherwise have offered about a crew member acting without his knowledge. Imogen laid out 3 paths forward, all running through channels considerably more serious than our earlier easement dispute with Bradley. First, the state's current use program itself needed formal notice of the falsified stewardship reports, since the entire cooperative's tax enrollment and every household's reduced tax bill tied to it depended entirely on that program's ongoing confidence in our compliance filings. Second, Vermont's timber trespass statute allows a landowner whose timber is cut and removed without authorization to recover treble damages, a criminal and civil remedy considerably more serious than an ordinary breach of contract claim, since state law treats unauthorized timber removal as something closer to theft than mismanagement. Third, the cooperative deserved a straightforward civil path to recover the profits Gareth had personally kept. I'd pursue all three simultaneously, Imogen told the board. The current use notice protects the tax enrollment everyone's household budget actually depends on. The timber trespass claim gets you treble damages rather than just the value of what was taken. And the conversion suit gives the cooperative a clean path to recover whatever profit Gareth kept for himself, beyond what even trebled timber damages would cover. We filed formal notice with the state's current use program that autumn, attaching the forestry auditor's full report and 10 years of reconciled harvest records. We filed the timber trespass claim the same week, and separately filed the civil conversion action seeking disgorgement of Gareth's personal profits. Here's the micro setback. The state's initial response placed Sugarbush Ridge's entire current use enrollment under a formal compliance review, pending its own investigation, a standard precaution that, while ultimately necessary, meant every property owner in the cooperative faced the possibility of a retroactive tax reassessment for the full period the falsified reports had been in effect, right as many of our smaller producer members were least able to absorb a surprise tax bill. This is the painful part of doing this the right way, Imogen told me. A compliance review protects the state program's own integrity while it investigates. It also means the cooperative absorbs real short-term uncertainty for a problem one person created. Millicent raised a second concern at that same meeting that hadn't fully occurred to me until she said it aloud. If Gareth anticipates this investigation dragging on, she said, there's nothing stopping him from continuing to consult for other small cooperatives across the state in the meantime, given how convincingly he can talk about forest management. Imogen agreed the concern was legitimate and flagged it directly to the State Forestry Division's licensing office, which added a note to its own regional file recommending any future client verify a consulting forester's harvest reconciliation independently before relying on self-reported figures. That autumn stretched longer than I'd hoped, largely because both the state's compliance review and the timber trespass claim moved at the deliberate pace these processes generally do, and more than one evening found me at my kitchen table with Imogen's case binder, wondering whether the retroactive tax exposure might simply become permanent before anyone finished sorting out what had actually happened. The turning point came when the state's own field auditor, conducting a full physical timber cruise of the entire tract, rather than relying on Gareth's prior submissions, confirmed that the Sugarbush's overall stocking remained genuinely within sustainable yield parameters once the unauthorized removals were properly accounted for, isolating the falsification cleanly to Gareth's own sales, rather than any broader mismanagement of the tract. The state lifted the compliance review within 6 weeks of that finding, once it became clear the underlying forest remained genuinely eligible for current use enrollment, and the falsification was attributable to one individual's conduct, rather than systemic neglect, restoring Sugarbush Ridge's enrollment with a formal notation requiring independent third-party verification of all future stewardship reports going forward. Millicent Vance called a special meeting that winter to formally present the results of both the state's review and the criminal timber trespass filing, a meeting that drew a larger turnout than any cooperative gathering I could remember in 4 years, including several producer members who'd never before attended a seasonal meeting, but who understood, now, exactly what a decade of unverified trust had put at risk for the whole cooperative's tax status and shared forest. I spent the afternoon before that meeting walking the upper Sugarbush alone, checking the repaired tubing crossing one more time, out of the same old habit that had started this whole process months earlier, and found myself thinking less about Gareth specifically than about how ordinary the whole slow drift into it must have felt from the inside. It's a strange thing, standing in a stand of maples you've walked 100 times, to realize the trees themselves had been telling a true story all along. It just took someone willing to actually count them against something other than one man's word. One of the cooperative's smaller producer members, a retired school teacher named Genevieve Coulter, who ran a modest 400-tap operation on her own 6 acres, stood during public comment and said something that landed harder in that room than almost anything Imogen or I had said all autumn. I trusted that stewardship plan to protect the tax status this whole property depends on, she said. I want to know how close we actually came to a retroactive tax bill I would never have been able to pay, without any of us ever understanding why. Bradley, whose own driveway dispute felt almost distant by comparison now, spoke next, addressing the room rather than the board directly. "I paid Gareth to handle something correctly and he didn't," he said. "Once I understood what else he might have been doing to the whole cooperative's tax standing, I didn't feel like that was something worth just letting go, because untangling it was inconvenient." The board voted unanimously that evening to formally terminate Gareth's contract and to adopt the state's required independent verification process permanently. And Otto Reinhold, who'd stayed largely quiet through most of the meeting after his one-pointed question weeks earlier, spoke again near the end, addressing the newer members directly. "Some of you weren't here when this cooperative organized the Sugar Bush back in 1961, he said. "I've spent 3 seasons learning this land from the ground up. We took the stewardship plan seriously, because the founders made us, and because it actually mattered to what this place became. I'd hate for anybody living here now to think that mattered less than it used to, just because somebody found a way to profit off cutting the corner." The county state's attorney, concluding the criminal timber trespass investigation that spring, charged Gareth under Vermont's statutory timber trespass provision, and the civil trial that followed awarded the cooperative treble damages on the full value of the unauthorized timber, plus disgorgement of the profits he'd personally kept. Genevieve Coulter's own producer operation, once the current use enrollment was fully restored and the required independent verification process was in place, qualified for a small state cost-share grant for Sugarbush improvement that following spring, a detail she made a point of sharing at the next general meeting. Gareth pleaded to a reduced set of charges that summer, rather than face a full jury trial on the complete scope of the case, accepting a sentence that included the treble damages restitution, a probation term, and a permanent bar from serving as a consulting forester of record for any current use enrollment in the state. The restitution order, once finalized, required Gareth to repay the treble damages on a structured schedule, with a portion of each payment directed specifically toward funding an independent forestry oversight program the state now offers to small agricultural cooperatives enrolled in current use, something Imogen told me was an unusually thoughtful addition to a restitution order of this kind. "Most restitution just goes back to the cooperative and nobody outside your community ever hears about it again," she said. "Getting a piece of it earmarked toward actually helping the next small cooperative verify its own forester's numbers is the kind of outcome that might genuinely help another community avoid exactly this situation." Otto Reinhold volunteered to serve as the Forestry Committee's liaison to the new independent verification process, given his own hands-on experience learning the tract. And Genevieve, once her own operations tax status was fully secured, became one of the most engaged new volunteers our committee had seen in years. I called Priscilla Okonjo back once the restitution order was finalized, mostly because I felt she deserved to know that the scheme she'd found so unusual over the phone had turned out to match our situation almost exactly. "I wish I could say I was surprised," she told me, "but I'm glad you had the reconciliation to actually prove it this time, instead of just a general sense that some of these cooperatives are left with. I've thought about that phone call more than once since. How a scheme brazen enough to genuinely surprise a career compliance auditor had still managed to run undetected in our own cooperative for 10 full years before anyone thought to check the underlying timber records. People sometimes ask whether one neighbor's driveway was really connected to a $210,000 timber theft scheme, or whether I simply got lucky pulling at a loose thread. I don't think it was luck, and I don't think the two things were ever as separate as they first looked. Both depended on the same quiet bet, that a small cooperative of dairy families turned maple producers, having found one professional fluent enough to trust completely, would never think to check whether that fluency was still being applied honestly. The question underneath all of it was never really about one severed sapline. It was about whether Sugarbush Ridge could trust that the forest management plan protecting our whole cooperative's tax status and shared future was actually being followed the way our founders designed it to be, or whether that protection would get quietly sold off, one falsified report at a time, by whoever figured out how convenient nobody else's scrutiny had become. My daughter Ingrid asked me, on one of her visits down from Burlington not long after the settlement, whether I regretted spending the better part of a year on a fight that started with a single neighbor's driveway, instead of just accepting the interim damages and letting the rest go. I told her the honest truth. No. Though I hadn't expected, at 63, to spend most of a year reading timber reconciliation reports and current use statute language, instead of just running the sugar house and watching the sap climb the way Arn and I always did together every March. She told me that sounded exactly like the kind of thing I'd spent 28 years training for, without ever expecting to actually need it, which is about as fair an assessment as anyone's offered me since. I think about Gareth more than I expected to, honestly, in the months since this resolved. 10 years is a long time to hold a cooperative's trust honestly before a pattern like this takes hold. I don't think he set out, in year 1, planning anything like what it eventually became. I suspect the first unreported sale, for a single convenient buyer, felt like an ordinary professional shortcut he intended to correct later, and each subsequent one simply got easier to justify than admitting the first one had crossed a line. I don't offer that as an excuse. I offer it because it's a more useful lesson than simply calling him greedy and moving on. Since the version of this story where somebody sets out from day one to steal an entire cooperative's timber is rarer than the version where somebody drifts into it one convenient shortcut at a time. Our tubing network ran clean and full this spring for the first time since Bradley's driveway went in, and I've taken to walking the repaired crossing most mornings during the boil, the same way I always did before any of this happened, just to confirm it for myself. Bradley stops by the sugar house most weeks now during the season, mostly to compare notes on how his crossing is holding up under the spring thaw, and I don't hold any of this against him. He was as much a client failed by Gareth's shortcuts as I was a neighbor harmed by them. Genevieve Coulter joined the forestry committee with me this year, the first new volunteer we've had in nearly 5 years, and she's brought a genuinely useful teacher's eye to explaining our stewardship obligations to newer members that I'd been handling almost entirely on technical instinct alone for years. Millicent Vance pushed through a permanent bylaw amendment requiring the state's independent verification process our own current use enrollment had always technically allowed for, finally adopted, plus a mandatory rotation of the consulting forester contract every 5 years, regardless of how trusted any single professional becomes. Otto Reinhold has taken to giving informal talks at our general meetings a couple of times a year now, walking newer members through the actual silviculture behind our stewardship plan, the way the founders understood it. Since he says half the disputes a cooperative like ours ever runs into start with somebody simply not understanding why a rule exists in the first place. I sat in on the first one myself, notebook in hand out of old habit, and found myself just as absorbed as any of the newcomers, hearing him explain a management plan I'd reviewed cold for years, but had never once heard laid out in quite that plain, patient way. The new independent verification process the state now requires has kept every marking survey and every stewardship report open to any cooperative member who asks, a policy so simple I sometimes wonder why it took a scheme this size to make it standard practice here. I've stopped by our new forestry liaison's files more than once now. Not because I doubt anything, but because I've found I like the reassurance of checking now and then, the same way I used to walk a finished timber sale site once more after a harvest crew packed up, just to be sure. I think too about how differently this could have gone if Bradley had simply paid his fine, moved his driveway, and none of us had ever thought to ask why an experienced forester would skip a review process he'd followed diligently for years on every other request. It's a lesson I've carried back into how I run my own operation now. Halverson Sugar Works keeps its own tap counts and yield records reconciled against actual jarred syrup every season, not because I distrust myself, but because I understand now, in a way I didn't fully appreciate before this happened, how easily even an honest system can quietly stop checking its own work once everyone gets comfortable enough to stop asking. Ingrid has started asking, on her visits down from Burlington, whether I'd consider stepping back from the forestry committee one of these years and letting somebody else carry the seasonal workload. For most of my 4 years here, I assumed I'd keep at it, until I genuinely couldn't walk the stands anymore. Now I think differently about it, not because the work's grown harder, but because I understand, in a way I didn't before Gareth, how much a cooperative benefits from more than one member actually knowing how to read a stand assessment. I've started mentoring Genevieve, specifically with that in mind, walking her through the full 10 years of reconciled harvest records, the way a Forest Service colleague once walked me through my first timber cruise, so that whenever I do eventually step back, this cooperative won't be relying on any single person's word again, the way it quietly did for a full decade, without ever quite meaning to. I got a call last month from a board member at a small maple cooperative on the other side of the state, a woman named Adoeze Fontaine, who'd read about our case in a regional agricultural newsletter and wanted to know how we'd gone about proving the harvest reconciliation held up under real scrutiny. I spent the better part of an hour on the phone with her, walking through the same stand-by-stand cross-check I'd run almost by instinct the week I first noticed Bradley's driveway had cut through more than just our tubing. It struck me, hanging up that call, that this was probably closer to the actual point of all of it than any restitution figure or criminal conviction. One more small cooperative somewhere else in this state, now knowing exactly what to check and exactly how to ask for it, before their own trusted forester's convenience quietly became something else entirely. I didn't do any of this out of anger at Bradley, or even really at Gareth, though I won't pretend the scale of what he was willing to risk over 10 years of small, compounding shortcuts doesn't still trouble me when I think about it. I did it because that stewardship plan was recorded in 1961 by families who understood this sugar bush couldn't survive being taken for granted, and because Millicent and Otto and Genevieve and a room full of neighbors were willing, once somebody showed them what was actually happening, to stand up and say it mattered. Turns out that's most of what keeping a cooperative's promise intact actually requires. Somebody willing to keep counting the trees, and enough neighbors willing, when it matters, to show up and ask why the numbers don't add up. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life themes and property, cooperative, and forestry regulations. Names, characters, and specific locations are fictional or have been changed for privacy. Visuals are generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only. This content is for entertainment purposes and does not constitute legal advice. If your cooperative's most trusted professional has been handling something highly specialized without much outside verification for years, would you know how to check whether that expertise is still being applied honestly?